So, this inquiry is going to last 6 weeks, and the committee has until February, a tight deadline. What are some of the key points that you're going to be watching for? And in particular, to help us understand sort of the purpose of this exercise.
Well, the inquiry is required by the Emergencies Act. It's always there if the government's decided to take those major steps. It's only fair that the public hears afterwards about exactly what was happening and why those steps were taken. So the inquiry itself is just a natural fallout from the emergency, from any declaration at the federal level.
Who's the spotlight really on here? Is it on the feds who enacted this and people say maybe when it wasn't needed? But is there also a spotlight and a focus on Ottawa officials who, some maybe felt that they didn't do what they could in their power and they kind of waited to pass the buck to another entity?
Ottawa and any capital city is a tough situation because geographically it's the city of Ottawa, but jurisdictionally, those convoy participants were there because it's the seat of the federal government. And so I do think that it was essentially a federal matter in that sense. They weren't protesting Ottawa, they were protesting Parliament in Ottawa.
We are going to hear from a number of witnesses. We heard there are some examples. One of them, of course, though, is the Prime Minister. How significant will his testimony be?
Well, it certainly will be very significant. The decision to declare the state of emergency comes from Cabinet, and certainly the Prime Minister is leading that. I'll be interested to see, beyond what Alberta and Saskatchewan have said, what Ontario has to say about the consultations prior to the declaration that they had with the feds.
And we have heard from other officials in Alberta who said, look, we were able to negotiate. We were able to do this without the Emergencies Act. How significant will it be to hear how these situations compared?
It's very significant because Alberta, Saskatchewan, other provinces have wording in their emergency management legislation that would allow them not only to acquire resources like trucks, but also to be able to order people to drive the trucks, whether that's a tow truck or anything else. Ontario's legislation does not provide that. In fact, it explicitly prevents them from requiring a person to take action. And so maybe Alberta and Saskatchewan had another card up their sleeve that Ontario didn't, and maybe that's why the conversation between Ontario and the federal government will be with more interest.
We're also going to hear from residents. We're going to hear from businesses. What impact do you think that might have on this report?
Well, clearly, the government's going to want to establish the fact that this was more than just a protest, that this was causing distress or some sort of harms beyond the normal disruptions of a protest. That and the question of whether or not the federal government was looking into the finance issues, which are clearly a federal matter, prior to the declaration. Again, it's not as much about geography as it is about jurisdiction. And so the federal government needed those international payment issues to bring in finance, which would make it clearly a federal matter.
The big question here, too, though, is what can really come out of all of this? Because, as you say, this is just kind of part of the process. It has to be done. They've got this 6-week window to talk to all of these people and come up with a report. But what can happen after that? Is it just about public knowledge? Is it just about transparency? Or can there be any recourse? Or maybe it could, trigger changes to the Emergency Act?
The inquiries, as was mentioned this morning, as it started, won't have binding recommendations or findings. But certainly the government and the opposition will both use the findings to drive their own agendas. What I'm hoping is that it'll actually have us look back at the Emergencies Act entirely to question a little bit more about why we didn't declare during COVID for the public welfare aspects, but did declare using the public order powers. Perhaps it's time for us to think about whether the federal government and how the federal government gets involved in emergencies across the country.
All right, Jack Lindsay, emergency studies expert at Brandon University. As we mentioned, this will continue for 6 weeks. No doubt we'll chat with you again. Thanks so much.
I look forward to it. Thank you.